What is up, guys? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. We got another reaction to you coming today. The decline of Sega. What happened? Let's not waste any
Sega
time. Let's go
used to
ahead
be
and
one of
hop
the
in.
biggest makers of video game consoles. Back in the early 90s, the Genesis was like one of the coolest things you can own. Millions of households were spending their evenings running around collecting rings as Sonic. That's what I always think of when I hear the name Sega. Well, that and
Truth.
Sega was so impactful, they really disturbed the industry, yet today they don't even make consoles anymore. There haven't been any for over 20 years now. They've spent that time mainly as a third-party video game developer. So in this
So
video,
sad.
I want to talk
What
about the
happened? I wonder
incredible
why that
rise
is.
and fall of Sega. The roots of it go all the way back to 1940 in Hawaii. They were originally known as Standard Games,
What?
a business
I
primarily
didn't
established to
realize
make
they were.
coin-operated games like slot machines to be sold on
Oh,
military bases. In the early 1950s,
okay.
a new gambling law was passed in the US that made things impractical, so they moved the business to Japan, renamed it Service Games of Japan, and began selling their coin-operated games to US military bases across Japan and the rest of Asia. Over the next decade or so, they
Interesting.
expanded to become major providers of pinball machines and jukeboxes. Then, in 1965, Service Games of Japan merged with a company called Rosen Enterprises. Now, that one was started by a man named David Rosen about a decade earlier. It was originally an art exporting business, but he had found success with coin-operated instant photo booths and eventually with arcade games. To name this combined company,
Okay.
they took the
That's
first
kind
two
of cool.
letters of the word Service Games, attached the word Enterprises from the other end, and called it Sega Enterprises. Their first big hit was this electromechanical submarine-type shooting game called Periscope. 4 years later, Sega
Interesting.
Enterprises was bought by Gulf and Western, a separate company with an extensive history, but I'll just mention that they had bought the film studio Paramount Pictures for over $100 million just 3 years earlier. Throughout the 1970s, utilizing
Wow.
that strong financial backing, Sega became one of the biggest makers of arcade games in the United States, operating a chain of arcades and shopping malls called Sega Centers, and buying another popular maker of arcade games called Gremlin,
Frogger.
even adopting the name Sega Gremlin before changing it to the much catchier Sega Electronics in the early 1980s. In 1983, there was an infamous video
Oh,
game
wow.
crash. I've talked about it on this channel before, but basically the quality of games had become questionable, people didn't want to play them as much, and the
Interesting.
whole industry took a major downturn, which of course was bad news for Sega. The poor performance motivated Gulf and Western to sell Sega's North American operations to Bally Midway, another complex company I'm sure many of the viewers are familiar with, but at this point they were already big in the arcade industry, known for their pinball machines and holding the licenses to some of the most popular games of the time, like Pac-Man and Space Invaders. So that was the American side of things, but not long after, the Japanese operations were bought by a group of investors led by David Rosen himself and heavily financed by Isao Okawa and his computer services company CSK, who would later become the president and chairman of Sega. With everything going so bad at their core arcade operations, the people at Sega figured that it would be a good time to make a home video game console, and that change in direction is ultimately what transformed them into the company that we all came to know. Their first ever attempt at a home video game console was the SG-1000, with the SG standing for Sega Game. It was released in Japan on July 15th, 1983, which unfortunately was the exact same day as Nintendo's Famicom. So clearly there was some tough competition,
Oh,
and
wow.
the SG-1000 didn't see
Those
nearly
things
the
look
same level of
absolutely
success, but it
insane.
did sell considerably more units than Sega was expecting, and that was enough motivation for them to continue on developing new consoles. Their second attempt was the redesigned SG-1002, released in Japan about a year later, followed by the Sega Mark III more than a year after
Okay,
that.
now they're starting to
That
look
one
a
is
little bit
significant
more
because it was
normal.
rebranded as the Master System that I imagine most of my audience may be more
Master
familiar
System
with,
Power
because in
Base.
1986 it became the first console Sega ever sold in the US market.
Let me know if you guys know of any of these, if you've ever seen one. I've never seen some of these older consoles. Some of these I didn't even know existed. Some of these are kind of surprising. Like the earliest I'm familiar with is like Sega Genesis, the original like Nintendo. You guys let me know.
All not a complete failure, but I think most would consider this to be a weak first attempt, considering that Nintendo's competing 8-bit system, the NES, sold about 10 times
Yep,
as
the
many that
NES.
year. Part of the reason for the low numbers would be the fact that Sega was mostly forced to develop their own games for the Master System because Nintendo had a rule where games made for their system couldn't be made for other systems, and since Nintendo was so much more popular, not many developers were choosing Sega instead. Also, their marketing and distribution were kind of a mess. The rights to do it were sold to Tonka, which proved to be a poor decision. They were a toy company without experience in this sort of thing, plus they were distracted by their acquisition of Kenner Toys that was happening simultaneously. Overall, just not the best times for Sega. They were making some valid attempts in the home console market, but they weren't doing anything spectacular enough to even come close to Nintendo. I mean, consider that Nintendo
We all know who
controlled an
Nintendo is
estimated
today.
80 to 90% of the home video game market. Numbers that made it seem impossible for anyone else to even be considered a major threat, let alone surpass them. But amazingly, that is what Sega was able to do with their next console, the Genesis. In the early 1990s, their sales were climbing at a tremendous rate, to a point where there were many reports estimating Sega's share of the US market to be above 60%.
Wow.
So given that this was
They were
one of the
growing
most
like crazy. Why
remarkable
didn't it
underdog
continue?
performances in, I would say, all of business history, I want to highlight some of the biggest ways they did it. First off, the Genesis was a 16-bit system. Not to get technical here by any means, but it refers to a more advanced computer chip that generally allowed the games to look and sound better when compared to Nintendo's existing 8-bit NES console. In fact, Nintendo didn't release their 16-bit
Hey,
version of the
Super
Super Nintendo
Nintendo.
until 1991. They could have potentially
I
done it
have one
much
of
earlier,
those.
but the NES was still
It's
selling
actually
so
right
well,
here,
they
right above
likely
me.
didn't want to release anything to replace it just yet. So because Nintendo was so slow about
Still
it, Sega
works. I
spent
still
more
have
than
a
2 years
good amount
as
of
the more
games for it.
technologically advanced console, and that was enough time to gain the public's attention and get their foot in the door. Another reason the Genesis was so successful was through aggressive marketing, which, by the way, was not handled by
Aggressive
Tonka.
marketing!
They wisely chose to do it themselves. Sega did have the more advanced technology, and you better believe that they let the public know about it at every chance they got. Oftentimes, calling out Nintendo
I want to see what
by
one of those
name.
ads
They
looked
commonly use
like.
the phrase blast processing, but probably the most famous campaign was the one where they said, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. A clever
Oh, I
little
remember
play on
that.
words that directly insults Nintendo and makes them look inferior. And once the Super Nintendo did finally come out, Sega chose to lower the price of the Genesis to a point that made it significantly cheaper. The Genesis was also attractive
That's
because
huge.
of the library of games that were available for it. Overall, a wide variety, but a big part of their strategy was to market games using celebrities. You know, all the sports games like Joe Montana Football, or even some unlikely creations like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. If you like those
The Joe
celebrities and
Montana
wanted to play their
Football, I've
game,
heard of
in
that
many
one.
cases, you would be forced
The
to buy
Michael
a
Jackson
Sega
Moonwalker,
Genesis.
I've
The
never
console
heard of
also
that
attracted
game.
many customers simply because they thought it was cool. I know
That's
it's
actually,
subjective,
that is
but
kind of
Sega
cool,
put
actually.
a lot of effort into attracting an edgier, older audience when compared to Nintendo. Here, just look at the consoles. Instead of a boxy white or gray look, they went with a sleek-looking black. If you watch almost any commercial for the Genesis, it is in your face, high energy with attitude kind of stuff. Maybe the ultimate way that I can convey their coolness and focus on an older audience is by looking at Mortal Kombat. For Nintendo's version, they took out the blood and reduced the violence, while Sega chose to keep all of it in there, and as you may have guessed, the Sega version sold much better. My fifth and final reason behind the success of the Genesis
People
does have
like the
some
blood and
overlap
gore
with my
for some
previous
reason.
but
I
we
don't know.
have to talk about Sonic. Can we all agree that Sonic is
Sonic.
essentially Sega's version of Mario? He's like the character that most represents the brand, but when compared to Mario, he has so much more attitude. I mean, he gets really impatient when you don't touch the controller for a few seconds. In 1991, Sega released their first ever Sonic game, a bestseller, and soon started bundling it together with the Genesis, clearly helping increase sales by
I'll be
making the
100%
console
honest,
look
I
more
used to
attractive.
really
So
enjoy
that is how
playing some of
Sega
the Sonic
propelled the Genesis
games.
forward and
Like
became
there's
a
one where you
major
have
threat to
like
Nintendo.
Chos,
That
I
is
believe
kind
is
of
what
where
they're
it
called.
ended. If we look at their earnings, we can
And you
see
get
that
to
they
like
peaked
raise
in
them and
1993
train
really
them,
took a negative turn
and then
in
you can make them fight against each
1998.
other.
So if you're a fan
That's
of Sega,
definitely my
this video
favorite
is about
Sonic
to take
game ever.
quite a negative turn as I talk about the decline of their business. For my first reason, I'm just gonna say that Nintendo woke up. Most would probably say that Nintendo made a mistake by sitting back and letting Sega catch up to them as much as they did, but to their credit, Nintendo was playing the long game. When When they did finally release the Super Nintendo in 1991, it was a huge success, bundled with Super Mario World and followed up with so many revolutionary games like Zelda, Link to the Past, Super Mario Kart, and of course Donkey Kong Country. All of them selling millions of copies, making the Super Nintendo look more attractive than the Genesis and helping them take back a good share of the market. In the end, the Super Nintendo did sell significantly more units than the Genesis. It was a fight where Sega got way further than anyone could have ever predicted. There were even points where it was looking like they had a real chance of winning, but the fact is that even in their best fight ever, Sega lost significantly.
Autumn is at your doorstep.
That's actually crazy. That's actually crazy. Because, like, they had such a steep progression where they were making so much money and then just out of nowhere just decline year after year after year until, like, they were basically donezo.
Worth mentioning would be the Genesis.
That's actually insane.
None of them were all that popular, specifically the Sega CD, at this point infamous in the gaming world. It was like this advanced add-on that allowed you to play CD-ROM games on your Genesis that were specifically made for it. A big issue is that it
That's
actually cost
interesting.
more than the Genesis itself. There weren't all that many games for it, and one of the few games, Night Trap, was singled out at a congressional hearing about video game violence, giving it all a negative reputation. Plus, there was a lack of support for the Sega
I think
CD
I've
after the
heard
company
of
started
that.
focusing their main efforts on their next console, which happens to be my next reason for their decline, the Sega Saturn. So much went wrong with the Saturn, never releasing a Sonic game for it, for example, but most of the
What
issues
is
stem from
the
the fact
Saturn?
that it was expected to compete against the Sony PlayStation. It was 1995, and there was a lot of hype surrounding Sony entering the market.
The
with their
original
own console,
PlayStation
and Sega
was
felt it was important
huge.
to get ahead of the game and release their console first.
So they have a
In May
disc
of
spot
that
and a
year, at
cartridge
E3,
spot.
Sega may have jumped the gun when they made an announcement saying that the
So is the
Saturn would
cartridge
be
spot so that you
available
could, like, play
immediately.
older
It
games?
caught many of the retailers off guard. They weren't really prepared with enough units, so it was hard for customers to find it. Plus, there were only 6 games available at that time, making it hard to justify
Hard for
paying a
customers to find it?
$400 price tag.
I
As it
think we can
was,
all
even
relate
the
to that
same
with
week,
the new
Sony
Xbox and the
announced
new
that would be
PlayStation.
priced at $300.
$100
savings,
cheaper.
along with some other factors, was enough to
That's
convince people
absolutely
to wait a few extra
insane.
months until the PlayStation was available. And obviously, I don't even think I have to say that the PlayStation was way more successful than the Saturn. My final reason for the decline of Sega.
Yeah, the
would be
PlayStation
their
was
next
absolutely
console, the
huge.
Dreamcast, which was
Oh,
probably
okay.
the biggest disaster of
I had
them
never
all.
heard of the
Released in
Saturn,
1998,
but I've heard of the
clearly, we were
Dreamcast.
already looking bad for Sega. The main feature was that it could connect to the internet, but in the days before Xbox Live, that really wasn't the most attractive feature, given the broadband connections just weren't where they needed to be yet. There were also arguments within the company delaying decisions and leading to higher costs. There were issues obtaining enough graphics chips, causing fewer systems to be available at launch than they had predicted. Meanwhile, the launch of the PS2 was right around the corner, further hurting sales. The whole thing was a disaster. In total, the Dreamcast sold only about 3 million
When you
units
look at
before Sega
that
announced
thing
they would stop
compared to the
making consoles altogether
PS2,
and put their entire efforts toward
it
making
just
games
doesn't
for
look like they
other
came out
consoles.
any
It's
time
now over 2 decades
close to
later,
each other.
Sega has yet to make another console.
Like, it looks like there
And
had to
Sega
have
at
been
the
like a
time,
decade in
Isao
between the
Okawa,
two.
who had taken over in the
That is
1980s,
absolutely
donated
insane.
almost $700 million of his own money to help the company make it through that transition, and he actually died only a couple weeks after that announcement. So that's what Sega's
Oh,
been up to ever
wow.
since, successfully reversing the trend and becoming profitable again by 2003, shortly before merging with Sammy Corporation in a $1.5 billion deal, who happens to be Japan's largest maker of pachinko machines. From there, they've continued their mission to be a third-party developer, building up their operation by acquiring other developers, and they even made a deal with Marvel to make video games to coincide with some of their movie releases. There have been more structural changes since then that are a lot to follow, but as I promised, that is the overall story of the incredible
I didn't know that
rise
they
and
made
fall
the
of
Iron Man
Sega.
game. That's
Let me know in the
interesting.
comments, have you ever
I used to
owned
watch
a
videos of the
Sega
Iron Man
game?
game all the time.
And what
It
do you
looked
think
like a
of it
pretty
compared to
good
Nintendo
game.
or the
I don't know
other
though.
ones available at the time?
I
This
still
video
can't believe the
might be much about
Dreamcast came
business
out that
approach to the
close to
topic
the
rather than creative.
PS2.
Let me know
That
what you
just
think of
blows my
all this. Maybe the most
mind.
applicable question would be, will Sega ever return to making consoles? And any other thoughts?
Honestly, I doubt they could return to making consoles. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think. Do you think anybody could compete in the console world outside of Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft? Like, I feel like at this point in time, the Xbox and the PlayStation are just too big for anybody else to compete. And then even like with Nintendo, with the Switch, like they have their own little corner of the market. I just don't feel like anybody else could get in and cash in on that. I feel like it's too crowded already. You guys let me know what you think, though. I enjoyed that. I hope you guys did as well. That is all for this one. I will see you guys in the next one. Just like me,